On February 19, 1943, in the rocky spine of central Tunisia, the United States Army met its first true reckoning of the Second World War. The place was the Battle of Kasserine Pass, a narrow mountain corridor cut through the Atlas Mountains, and the result would be measured not in ground gained, but in men captured, tanks destroyed, and confidence shattered. The pass itself was deceptively small. Barely 2 miles wide, Kasserine Pass was not a battlefield chosen for glory. It was a funnel, a crack in the mountains where roads, retreating columns, artillery, fuel trucks, and armored units were forced together under fire. Whoever controlled that gap controlled movement across central Tunisia. Whoever lost it risked losing everything behind it. For the Americans, this was not supposed to be the decisive fight. U.S. forces had landed in North Africa months earlier under Operation Torch, advancing eastward with relative speed. Resistance had been uneven, morale was high, training manuals were fresh, equipment was modern, but experience, real experience against German armored formations, was almost non-existent. The German side was the opposite. Veteran formations hardened in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front now stood across the pass. Their commanders understood how to exploit terrain, how to probe for weakness, and how to break an enemy who had not yet learned how modern mechanized warfare actually felt under pressure. Between February 19th and February 24th, 1943, the fighting around Kasserine Pass would produce one of the most lopsided shockwaves of the Western Allied War. By the time the smoke cleared, Allied losses across the Kasserine-Sidi-Bouzid battles were commonly summarized at around 10,000 men, a figure that included killed, wounded, and captured. Embedded within that number were approximately 3,000 American soldiers taken prisoner, a humiliation that cut deeper than casualty lists. The material cost was just as stark. U.S. and Allied forces lost roughly 183 tanks, 208 artillery pieces, and more than 600 vehicles, destroyed, abandoned, or captured as formations unraveled. These numbers would be repeated for decades in after-action reports, military schools, and command briefings because they told a simple truth. The U.S. Army had been caught unprepared. Across the pass, German and Italian losses were far lower. Axis casualties for the same period are often cited at under 1,000 total, with roughly 20 tanks lost, a fraction of Allied equipment losses. The imbalance was not just tactical, it was psychological. One side learned. The other paid for that lesson in real time. The terrain amplified everything. Kasserine Pass sat between steep ridgelines, forcing armored columns into predictable lanes of advance. When movement stalled, targets stacked. When artillery fire fell, there was nowhere to disperse. Retreat routes overlapped with supply routes. Confusion spread faster than orders. Radios failed. Units that had trained separately now fought together without cohesion. This was not a single catastrophic moment. It was a chain reaction. What began as pressure on forward positions turned into withdrawals. Withdrawals turned into traffic jams. Traffic jams turned into captured columns. Each mile closer to the pass multiplied losses, until the narrow gap became a trap rather than an escape. For American soldiers on the ground, this was the first time facing coordinated German armor, infantry, and artillery in a fluid battlefield. Tanks appeared where maps said they should not. Anti-tank guns opened fire from concealed slopes. Luftwaffe aircraft struck columns already struggling to move through the pass. Command decisions made miles away arrived too late to stop what was already unfolding. What made Kasserine so damaging was not only what happened there, but what it revealed. The battle exposed weaknesses in leadership structure, unit deployment, and combined arms coordination. American units were spread too thin. Artillery was often underused or mispositioned. Armor was committed piecemeal, rather than massed. Defensive positions were chosen without regard for mutual support. Numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. 2 miles of terrain, 5 days of fighting, roughly 10,000 Allied casualties, over 180 tanks gone, thousands of prisoners. These figures were not exaggerated later for effect. They were recorded because they were undeniable. Yet the battle did not end in collapse. That is what makes Kasserine different from disasters that end campaigns. The Germans pushed hard, but they did not annihilate Allied forces. Logistics, overextension, and shifting priorities eventually slowed the Axis advance. By February 24th, the immediate crisis had passed. The Allies still held Tunisia. The front stabilized. But the damage was done. Kasserine Pass became a name spoken quietly in headquarters tents and loudly in after-action reviews. It was the battle that forced the U.S. Army to confront reality, not in theory, not in training. In blood, steel, and prisoners marching east. Within weeks, command changes would follow. Doctrine would change. Discipline would tighten. The army that walked into Kasserine would not be the same army that fought later in Tunisia, Sicily, and France. But that transformation began here, in a narrow gap in the mountains, where optimism collided with experience. Kasserine Pass was not the beginning of American involvement in the war. It was the end of American innocence in it. By the time fighting reached the narrow mouth of Battle of Kasserine Pass, the outcome had already been shaped days earlier by geography, command structure, and a series of decisions that looked reasonable on paper, but collapsed under pressure. The American problem in central Tunisia was not bravery or equipment. It was positioning. WWII Corps was responsible for a wide stretch of rugged terrain spanning multiple mountain passes in the Atlas Range. Instead of concentrating strength, forces were scattered across forward positions meant to hold ground rather than absorb and counterattack. This dispersion would prove fatal once German armor began to move. The Atlas Mountains in Tunisia are not a single ridge. They are a layered system of ridgelines, valleys, and passes that funnel movement into predictable corridors. Kasserine Pass itself was only one of several gaps, but it was the most direct route between eastern and western Tunisia. Roads converged there. Supply routes ran through it. Retreat paths depended on it. Losing control of that corridor meant chaos behind it. American units were positioned forward, often on isolated hilltops and ridges, with limited mutual support. Some positions were miles apart, separated by broken terrain that made rapid reinforcement nearly impossible. On maps, these deployments looked orderly. In reality, they meant that when one position collapsed, the next could not react in time. This vulnerability was exposed days before Kasserine itself became the focal point. At Sidi Bouzid, east of the pass, German forces struck American units holding exposed ground. By the night of February 16, 1943, U.S. WWII Corps had already suffered approximately 1,600 casualties, lost nearly 100 tanks, 57 half-tracks, and 29 artillery pieces in that sector alone. These were not small skirmish losses. They were the warning signs of a structural failure. Instead of halting and consolidating after Sidi Bouzid, the American line bent backward toward the mountain passes. Withdrawals were ordered, but they occurred under pressure, with German units advancing aggressively and probing for openings. As formations pulled back, roads filled with vehicles, guns, and infantry units converging on the same routes. This is where Kasserine's geography turned a retreat into a disaster. A 2-mile-wide pass cannot absorb multiple withdrawing formations at once. Traffic bottlenecks formed almost immediately. Artillery units struggled to redeploy. Fuel trucks blocked armor. Infantry units lost contact with their commanders. Once the Germans began shelling and probing the pass itself, movement slowed to a crawl. Command structure compounded the problem. 2 Corps headquarters was positioned far to the rear, physically distant from frontline units. Orders were often delayed, incomplete, or disconnected from conditions on the ground. Junior commanders hesitated to act independently. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery, essential for modern warfare, was inconsistent at best. German forces recognized this weakness quickly. Their doctrine emphasized concentration of force, combined arms, and rapid exploitation. Armor did not advance alone. Tanks moved with infantry support. Anti-tank guns were placed to cover likely counterattack routes. Artillery was used aggressively to disrupt movement rather than simply bombard positions. By contrast, American armor was often committed in small packets, sent forward piecemeal rather than massed. Tanks fought alone or with minimal infantry cover. When resistance stiffened, withdrawals were ordered instead of coordinated counterblows. Each retreat ceded more initiative. Numbers make the exposure clear. By the time the fighting centered on Kasserine Pass itself, Allied forces faced German and Italian formations numbering roughly 22,000 infantry supported by an estimated 212 tanks. The Americans had more men on paper, around 30,000 infantry in the broader sector, but they were divided, stretched thin, and unable to concentrate quickly at decisive points. The Germans did not need to destroy the entire Allied force. They only needed to keep it off balance long enough for the pass to clog. Once that happened, material losses skyrocketed. Tanks ran out of fuel while idling. Guns were abandoned when horses or trucks could not reach them. Vehicles were destroyed simply because there was no room to turn around. Captured soldiers followed the same pattern. Units retreating through the pass found themselves cut off when German armor reached road junctions behind them. Columns surrendered, not because they were surrounded on open ground, but because the road ahead and behind was blocked. This is how the number of approximately 3,000 Allied prisoners accumulated so quickly. The exposure was also psychological. American troops had trained for defense in advance, not for fighting while withdrawing under armor pressure. When orders changed rapidly, hold, withdraw, counterattack, withdraw again, cohesion suffered. German units exploited hesitation, probing until resistance cracked, then pushing through with speed. Importantly, this was not a failure of courage. American units fought hard in many places. Individual actions slowed German advances and bought time. But bravery cannot compensate for systemic weakness. Once the structure failed, losses mounted regardless of effort. By February 19th, when German forces began pressing directly into Kasserine Pass, the Allied position was already compromised. The pass was no longer a defensive choke point. It was a crowded corridor filled with exhausted units, damaged equipment, and confused command relationships. This is why Kasserine mattered. It was not an ambush or a surprise attack in isolation. It was the inevitable collision of inexperience, overextension, and a battlefield designed to punish both. The losses that followed, 183 tanks, 208 guns, over 600 vehicles, and around 10,000 casualties, were not created in a single moment. They were the cumulative cost of exposure. The Americans would learn from this, but first, they had to survive what came next. When the Germans pushed fully into the pass, and the narrow gap in the mountains became the center of the war in Tunisia. Before the name Kasserine Pass entered Allied memory as shorthand for disaster, the collapse began farther east, around the flat, exposed ground near Sidi Bou Zid. What happened there between February 14th and February 16th, 1943, did not merely weaken the American line. It tore open the door through which German armor would surge toward the mountain passes. Sidi Bou Zid sat in a shallow basin at the edge of the Atlas foothills. Unlike Kasserine, it offered no natural choke points. Instead, it was surrounded by low hills and ridges that dominated the roads below. American units were positioned forward, occupying isolated high ground in an effort to block Axis movement westward. On paper, the plan looked sound. In practice, it placed U.S. forces exactly where German doctrine was strongest. The American formations in the area belonged to U.S. WWII Corps, tasked with holding a broad front across central Tunisia. Their positions around Sidi Bouzid were spread out, often miles apart, with limited lateral communication. Infantry, armor, and artillery were not integrated into tight, mutually supporting groups. Each strongpoint was expected to hold its own. German commanders immediately recognized the opportunity. Veteran panzer divisions maneuvered around the American hilltop positions, rather than attacking them head-on. Tanks moved through the low ground, cutting roads and supply routes, isolating strongpoints one by one. American units found themselves surrounded without realizing it until escape routes were already under fire. The first heavy blows landed on February 14th. German armor struck with speed and coordination, supported by infantry and artillery. American tank units attempted to counterattack but were often committed piecemeal. Instead of massing armor for a decisive blow, tanks were sent forward in small groups, where they were picked off by German anti-tank guns and maneuvering panzers. By February 15th, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Radio communications faltered. Units received conflicting orders: hold ground, withdraw, counterattack, sometimes within hours. Without clear coordination, withdrawals became disorganized. Vehicles clogged roads. Artillery struggled to reposition. Infantry units abandoned heavy equipment simply to keep moving. The losses accumulated with shocking speed. By the night of February 16, 1943, U.S. WWII Corps had already lost approximately 1,600 men killed, wounded, or captured in the Sidi Bouzid fighting. The material losses were even more devastating. Nearly 100 American tanks were destroyed or abandoned. 57 half-tracks and 29 artillery pieces were lost in just 2 days of combat. These numbers matter because they predate Kasserine itself. They show that the battle was not a sudden failure at the pass, but a cascading collapse that began in open terrain where the Americans had no margin for error. German losses during the same period were far lower. While exact figures vary by source, Axis tank losses at Sidi Bouzid were minimal compared to American losses. German units maintained cohesion, withdrew when necessary, and preserved combat power for the next phase of the operation. The psychological impact on American troops was immediate. Many units were experiencing their first sustained combat against German armor. They were facing an enemy that did not pause, did not retreat when fired upon, and did not fight by the rules they had trained for. German tanks maneuvered aggressively, using terrain, smoke, and flanking movements to unhinge defenses. What made Sidi Bouzid especially damaging was how it set conditions for everything that followed. The destruction of American armor and artillery meant that the units falling back toward the Atlas passes did so with diminished firepower. The loss of vehicles and fuel reduced mobility. Command confusion at Sidi Bouzid carried forward as units withdrew westward. As American forces pulled back, the map funneled them toward a limited number of routes that led directly to Kasserine Pass and neighboring gaps in the mountains. Each retreating column carried with it the wreckage of earlier fighting, damaged tanks, exhausted infantry, and vehicles loaded with wounded. The Germans understood this perfectly. Sidi Bouzid was not an end in itself. It was the opening punch. By smashing forward positions and forcing a withdrawal, German commanders ensured that the decisive phase would occur not on open ground, but inside narrow passes, where Allied numerical strength would be neutralized. By the evening of February 16th, the American front in central Tunisia was no longer a line. It was a series of disconnected elements retreating toward the mountains under pressure. The losses already suffered, 1,600 men and nearly 100 tanks, meant that the Saudi Corps entered the next phase already weakened. This is where the numbers begin to compound. Tanks lost at Sidi Bouzid could not be replaced in time for Kasserine. Artillery abandoned there would not be available to cover the passes. Units that surrendered or were destroyed could not slow the German advance days later. When historians later cited the full cost of Kasserine, around 10,000 Allied casualties, 183 tanks, 208 guns, over 600 vehicles, and 3,000 prisoners, those totals included the wreckage created here. Sidi Bouzid was the first ledger entry in a growing account of loss. For the American command, the lesson was brutal but clear. Forward positions without mutual support were invitations to disaster. Armor without infantry was vulnerable. Artillery not integrated into a unified fire plan was ineffective. And above all, a retreat through restrictive terrain under enemy pressure could multiply losses faster than any direct assault. As darkness fell on February 16th, German armor regrouped, refueled, and prepared to push west. American forces regrouped as well, but they did so while moving backward into narrower terrain with fewer tanks and fewer guns than they had started with. The road from Sidi Bouzid led straight into the mountains, and waiting there was a 2-mile-wide gap that would decide whether the retreat could be stabilized or whether it would turn into something far worse. When the fighting converged on Battle of Kasserine Pass, the outcome was not determined by bravery or numbers alone. It was shaped by which units arrived, how they were structured, and what kind of war they had already fought. Kasserine was a collision between an army still learning how to fight modern armored warfare and an opponent that had refined it through years of survival. On the Axis side, the attacking force was compact, experienced, and flexible. German units operating in central Tunisia drew heavily from formations that had already fought in Europe and North Africa. Among the most prominent were elements of the 10th Panzer Division and the 21st Panzer Division, supported by Italian armored units, including elements commonly associated with the Centauro Armored Division. These formations were not at full strength, but they were cohesive and battle-hardened. The total Axis force committed to the Kasserine Sidi Bouzid operations is often summarized at roughly 22,000 infantry, supported by approximately 212 tanks. That number matters because it shows that the Germans did not enjoy overwhelming numerical superiority. What they possessed instead was concentration, experience, and clarity of command. German panzer divisions were built to fight as integrated systems. Tanks did not operate alone. Infantry moved with them, clearing ground and protecting flanks. Anti-tank guns followed close behind, positioned to break counterattacks. Artillery was mobile and responsive, used to disrupt movement rather than simply batter fixed positions. Communications were direct and fast. When an opportunity appeared, it was exploited immediately. On the Allied side stood U.S. US-2 Corps, nominally strong on paper. In the broader sector, Allied forces could count around 30,000 infantry, including American units reinforced by British elements such as the 6th Armored Division, along with French forces operating on adjacent fronts. In theory, this gave the Allies an advantage in manpower. In practice, those numbers were misleading. The Allied force was fragmented across a wide front, with units scattered among ridges, passes, and road junctions. Many formations had never fought together before. Equipment was modern, but crews were inexperienced. Command relationships were complex, layered across national and corps-level structures that slowed decision-making. US-2 Corps itself was still finding its identity. Many of its commanders had trained extensively in the United States, but had limited experience coordinating infantry, armor, and artillery under combat conditions. Tanks were often viewed as independent weapons rather than components of a combined arms system. Artillery, though plentiful, was not always massed or employed with the speed that German doctrine demanded. The contrast in experience was stark. German tank commanders at Kasserine had learned hard lessons in France and Russia. They understood how to maneuver under fire, how to disengage, and how to strike at weak points rather than strong ones. They had fought retreats and breakthroughs before. For many American tank crews, this was their first sustained encounter with a professional armored opponent. Equipment differences played a role, but were not decisive on their own. American tanks were not inherently inferior in firepower or mobility. What mattered was how they were used. German units tended to mass armor at decisive points, while American tanks were frequently spread across defensive positions or committed in small groups to plug gaps. This fragmentation became critical as fighting moved toward Kasserine Pass. Units that might have formed a coherent defensive line instead arrived in dribs and drabs. Some formations were already depleted from losses at Sidi Bouzid, having lost nearly 100 tanks and dozens of guns before the main battle even began. Others arrived without clear orders, unsure whether they were meant to defend, delay, or counterattack. The Italians, often underestimated in popular memory, played a supporting but important role. Italian armored and infantry units provided additional manpower and equipment, allowing German commanders to focus their panzer forces at key points. While Italian formations did not drive the breakthrough alone, they contributed to holding ground and extending the pressure on Allied defenses. Command clarity also favored the Axis. German commanders operated with a clear operational objective: push through the mountain passes, disrupt Allied rear areas, and force a wider collapse. They were not required to seize and hold large amounts of territory. This flexibility allowed them to disengage when resistance stiffened and redirect effort elsewhere. By contrast, Allied commanders faced conflicting priorities. They were expected to hold ground, protect supply routes, support neighboring units, and respond to fast-moving threats, all with forces already under strain. Orders often arrived late or contradicted earlier instructions. This hesitation was fatal in a fast-moving armored battle. The imbalance in losses underscores how these differences played out. By the end of the fighting, Allied forces had lost approximately 183 tanks, 208 artillery pieces, and more than 600 vehicles. Axis losses, by comparison, included around 20 tanks, 14 guns, and roughly 67 vehicles, with total casualties often cited at 989 killed, wounded, or missing, plus about 608 captured. These figures are not simply tallies. They reflect the efficiency with which each side fought. German units preserved combat power even while attacking. Allied units hemorrhaged equipment during withdrawals and reorganizations. Tanks were lost not only to enemy fire, but to fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and abandonment under pressure. The order of battle also shaped morale. German units entered the fight confident in their methods. American units entered it uncertain of theirs. As losses mounted and communications broke down, that confidence gap widened. Each successful German maneuver reinforced their momentum. Each stalled Allied response deepened confusion. By February 19th, when pressure mounted directly on Kasserine Pass, the forces colliding there were no longer evenly matched in readiness. The Axis formations were intact, coordinated, and aggressive. The Allied defenders were depleted, fragmented, and fighting on ground that magnified every mistake. This imbalance does not diminish the courage of the soldiers involved. It explains why courage alone could not prevent disaster. Battles are won by systems as much as by individuals, and at Kasserine, one system functioned under stress while the other did not. The stage was now fully set. German armor and infantry, sharpened by earlier victories, pushed toward a narrow 2-mile gap already clogged with retreating Allied units. American forces, weakened by earlier losses and hampered by command confusion, prepared to make a stand, or at least slow the advance. What happened next would determine whether Kasserine Pass became a temporary setback or a complete rupture. The fighting that followed would compress days of learning into hours of chaos. By the morning of February 19, 1943, the focus of the campaign in central Tunisia narrowed to a single, unforgiving feature of the landscape: Battle of Kasserine Pass itself. What had been a broad maneuver battle days earlier, now compressed into a corridor barely 2 miles wide, flanked by steep ridges that dominated every road, gun position, and movement below. The pass was never designed to absorb a retreat under pressure. Its roads twisted through rocky ground, rising and falling between slopes that offered ideal observation and firing positions. Every vehicle that entered slowed the next. Every delay multiplied vulnerability. On February 19th, the pass was already crowded before the main German thrust even began. Retreating Allied units from Sidi Bou Zid and neighboring sectors arrived throughout the night and early morning. Columns of tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, ambulances, and infantry all converged on the same routes. Damaged vehicles blocked narrow stretches of road. Fuel shortages forced tanks to idle or shut down entirely. Commanders struggled to impose order on formations that had not planned to fight here. This congestion mattered more than any single tactical decision. Once the Germans began applying pressure, the pass turned from a route of withdrawal into a funnel of losses. German forces approached deliberately. Rather than charging headlong into the pass, Axis units probed, shelled, and maneuvered along the ridges and approaches. Artillery fire targeted junctions and bottlenecks, not fortified strongpoints. The goal was disruption, not annihilation. If movement stopped, capture would follow. American defensive positions inside the pass were improvised. Some artillery units attempted to deploy on the valley floor, only to find themselves under direct observation from higher ground. Infantry dug in along slopes and road edges, often without clear fields of fire or coordinated support. Tank units attempted to form blocking positions, but were constrained by terrain and traffic. Throughout the morning, German armor and infantry increased pressure along multiple approaches. Rather than committing all forces at once, German commanders fed units into the fight where resistance appeared weakest. This kept Allied defenders guessing and prevented the formation of a coherent defensive line. Communications quickly became a critical problem. Radio traffic jammed. Orders conflicted. Some units were told to hold at all costs. Others received instructions to withdraw further west. In the chaos of the pass, these orders collided. Units attempting to advance to defensive positions met withdrawing columns head-on. Vehicles turned around only to find roads blocked behind them. This is where the numbers that would later define Kasserine began to surge. Tanks abandoned because they could not maneuver counted the same as tanks destroyed by enemy fire. Artillery pieces left behind to keep columns moving were lost forever. Every abandoned gun increased the total that would later be recorded as 208 artillery pieces lost. By midday on February 19th, German forces had effectively gained fire control over key sections of the pass. This did not mean the Americans stopped fighting. They fought hard, often at close range. But fighting inside a narrow corridor favors the attacker who controls the high ground. German units could disengage, reposition, and strike again. Allied units could only react. One of the most damaging effects of the fighting was psychological compression. Soldiers could see the traffic jams. They could see vehicles burning ahead and behind them. Retreat felt impossible. Advance seemed suicidal. Under these conditions, unit cohesion eroded rapidly. Small groups fought independently, often unaware of what neighboring units were doing. As the day wore on, German armor reached points where it could threaten to cut the pass entirely. This was the nightmare scenario Allied commanders feared. If German tanks reached the western exits, thousands of troops inside the pass would be trapped. Orders to hold became desperate attempts to buy time, rather than realistic plans to reverse the situation. casualties mounted steadily. While exact hourly figures are impossible to pin down, the pattern was clear. Losses that day were driven less by pitched battles than by collapse under pressure. Units that attempted to stand were flanked. Units that attempted to withdraw were shelled and cut off. Prisoners were taken in clusters, not trickles. This is how the figure of approximately 3,000 Allied prisoners would eventually be reached. Many were not captured after prolonged fighting. They were captured when columns were halted, surrounded by fire, and left without viable escape routes. German losses on February 19th were comparatively light. Axis units maintained momentum while preserving their armored strength. Tanks withdrew when threatened, then returned from different angles. Anti-tank guns covered likely counterattack routes. Artillery remained mobile and responsive. The imbalance was visible, even as the battle unfolded. American equipment losses accelerated rapidly. Tanks burned along the roadways or sat silent with empty fuel tanks. Trucks and half-tracks were destroyed simply to clear paths. Each destroyed vehicle added to what would later be tallied as over 600 Allied vehicles lost. By nightfall, the situation inside Kasserine Pass was dire, but not yet hopeless. Allied forces still held portions of the corridor. German units had not fully sealed the exits, but the cost of holding was growing by the hour. The pass had become exactly what German commanders intended, a place where Allied numerical strength was meaningless. The key failure on February 19th was not a single decision or unit. It was the inability to impose order inside a collapsing system. The pass magnified every weakness already exposed at Sidi Bou Zid: fragmentation, delayed orders, piecemeal armor employment, and punished them with relentless efficiency. When darkness fell, fighting did not fully stop. Artillery fire continued. Units repositioned under cover of night. Both sides prepared for what they knew would be decisive days ahead. For the Americans, the question was no longer how to stop the German advance outright. It was whether they could stabilize the situation before losses reached irreversible levels. The numbers already told a grim story. By the end of February 19th, the path toward totals like 183 tanks lost, and around 10,000 Allied casualties was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding in real time, one blocked road and abandoned gun at a time. The pass was still contested, but it was no longer neutral ground. It had become a trap, and the next 48 hours would decide how many men and machines would escape it. As dawn broke on February 20th, 1943, the battle inside Battle of Kasserine Pass entered its most dangerous phase. The previous day had turned the pass into a choke point. Now German commanders sought to transform that choke point into a breakthrough, one that would open the road west toward Tebessa, a critical Allied supply hub whose capture could unravel the entire central Tunisian front. The objective was clear. If German armor could punch through the western exits of Kasserine Pass, it would threaten Allied depots, airfields, and command nodes. This was not about holding ground. It was about destabilizing the Allied rear so thoroughly that resistance would collapse across a wide front. Inside the pass, Allied forces were still fighting, but they were fighting under cumulative strain. Units that had held positions on February 19th were now depleted. Ammunition stocks were uneven. Fuel shortages worsened. Artillery units that had survived the previous day struggled to reposition because roads remained clogged with wreckage and abandoned vehicles. German pressure increased methodically. Rather than launching a single massed assault, Axis units advanced along multiple routes, probing for weak points and applying steady fire. This approach kept Allied defenders reacting rather than organizing. Every attempt to establish a firm defensive line was disrupted before it could solidify. By midday on February 20th, German forces began threatening the western approaches to the pass. This created panic at higher Allied headquarters. The possibility of losing Tebessa, located only a short distance beyond the mountains, forced commanders to consider the unthinkable: a deeper withdrawal that could expose neighboring Allied sectors. Orders began to shift. Defensive instructions were revised. Counterattacks were planned and canceled. Some units were told to hold ground regardless of cost. Others were ordered to disengage to prevent encirclement. These conflicting directives filtered down slowly, often arriving after conditions on the ground had already changed. The effect on unit cohesion was severe. Infantry units attempted to hold ridgelines without adequate artillery support. Tank units moved forward to plug gaps, only to find themselves without infantry cover. When resistance stiffened, withdrawals occurred under fire, adding to the tally of abandoned equipment. This is where the loss figures accelerated toward their final totals. Tanks ran dry of fuel while maneuvering on steep slopes. Guns were destroyed by their crews to prevent capture. Vehicles that could not be turned around were pushed off the road or set ablaze. Each decision made in desperation fed the statistics that would later define the battle. 183 tanks, 208 guns, and over 600 vehicles lost. Prisoners were taken in increasing numbers. As German units cut across road junctions west of the pass, retreating Allied columns found themselves halted by fire ahead and blocked by congestion behind. In these moments, surrender was often the only option. The figure of approximately 3,000 Allied prisoners was not the result of one encirclement, but dozens of small collapses repeated across 2 days. Despite the mounting losses, the Allied line did not fully disintegrate. Elements of British and American units managed to establish temporary blocking positions west of the pass. Artillery fire, when it could be coordinated, slowed German advances. Air support began to improve as weather conditions allowed for more sorties. On February 21st, German momentum began to slow. Supply lines stretched back through difficult terrain. Fuel consumption rose as armor maneuvered constantly. German commanders, while aggressive, were cautious not to overextend. The initial objective of destabilizing the Allied rear had been partially achieved, but the cost-benefit balance was shifting. At the same time, Allied resistance hardened incrementally. Units that had survived the worst of February 19-20 began to regroup. Artillery was massed more effectively. Defensive positions were selected with greater attention to mutual support. The chaos inside the pass gradually gave way to something closer to order. Still, the danger was not over. On the evening of February 21st, the outcome remained uncertain. German forces had not broken through to Tebessa, but they were close enough to keep Allied commanders on edge. Every mile of ground contested represented time. Time for reinforcements to arrive, time for coordination to improve, time for the bleeding to slow. The numbers at this stage told a grim but stabilizing story. Allied losses were already catastrophic by any standard, yet the line held. Axis casualties, often cited at under 1,000 total for the entire operation, remained relatively low, underscoring how efficiently the Germans had fought. But efficiency alone could not guarantee strategic success. February 20-21 marked the high watermark of the German offensive at Kasserine. Beyond this point, further advances risked diminishing returns. The Allies were wounded but not broken. Their supply lines, though threatened, were still intact. Most importantly, the Germans had failed to achieve a decisive rupture. For the men inside the pass, survival during these 2 days felt like victory enough. For commanders, it was a narrow escape that exposed just how close disaster had come. The battle had not yet ended, but its character was changing, from collapse to containment. The question now was whether the Allies could turn containment into recovery, or whether another push would reopen the wounds of the previous days. By February 22, 1943, the character of the fighting at Battle of Kasserine Pass changed in a way that was subtle on the map, but decisive on the ground. The previous 3 days had been defined by collapse, congestion, and capture. This day was defined by something new, resistance that finally began to cohere. The Germans entered February 22nd, expecting to finish what they had started. Their armor had pushed deep into the mountain approaches. Allied losses were already staggering. The roads through the pass still bore the scars of the previous days: burned vehicles, destroyed guns, abandoned equipment. From a purely tactical standpoint, it appeared that one more strong push could still tip the balance. But momentum in warfare is fragile. And on this day, multiple small factors combined to slow, then halt, the German advance. The first change was Allied artillery employment. By February 22nd, surviving Allied commanders had learned, through brutal necessity, how to mass fire quickly. Instead of dispersing guns in isolated batteries, artillery began firing in coordinated concentrations. When German armor appeared on likely avenues of advance, shells arrived faster and in greater volume than on previous days. This was not a sudden technological improvement. The guns were always there. What changed was how they were used. Fire missions were simplified. Target priorities were clearer. German movement through narrow approaches made them vulnerable to well-placed barrages. For the first time in the battle, German units began to slow not because of logistics, but because advancing further risked unacceptable losses. The second change was terrain exploitation by the defenders. Allied units began selecting positions with mutual support in mind. Infantry occupied ridgelines that could observe approaches. Anti-tank guns were placed to cover choke points, rather than scattered across wide fronts. Tanks, when committed, were used more cautiously, supporting infantry instead of charging forward alone. This shift did not reverse the losses already suffered. The numbers were already baked in: around 10,000 Allied casualties, 183 tanks, 208 artillery pieces, over 600 vehicles, and approximately 3,000 prisoners would remain the enduring statistics of the battle. But it prevented those numbers from growing even worse. German commanders sensed the change almost immediately. Probing attacks met heavier resistance. Artillery fire disrupted movement earlier and more effectively. The easy gains of February 19th and 20 were no longer available. Each additional kilometer forward required disproportionate effort. Logistics now began to weigh heavily on the Axis side. German armored units operating in the Atlas Mountains faced fuel constraints, maintenance issues, and increasingly stretched supply lines. Tanks that maneuvered constantly consumed fuel rapidly. Artillery ammunition stocks thinned. Casualties, while still relatively low compared to Allied losses, accumulated enough to reduce operational tempo. Axis casualty figures for the entire operation are often summarized at 989 killed, wounded, or missing, with equipment losses around 20 tanks, 14 guns, and 67 vehicles, plus roughly 608 captured. These numbers, small relative to Allied losses, still mattered because they came from elite units whose effectiveness depended on cohesion and momentum. Every loss reduced flexibility. Another critical factor was Allied air support. Weather conditions improved, allowing more consistent sorties. While air power did not decisively smash German formations, it complicated movement and added pressure to already strained supply lines. German units could no longer maneuver as freely in daylight without risk. On the ground, Allied morale stabilized just enough to hold. This is often misunderstood. February 22nd was not a day of triumph. It was a day when panic receded. Units stopped retreating blindly. Orders began to make sense. Commanders, now fully aware of the consequences of failure, focused on containment rather than counterattack. This containment mattered enormously. As long as the western exits of Kasserine Pass remained contested, the nightmare scenario, German armor breaking through toward Tebessa, remained unrealized. Each hour bought time for reinforcements, coordination, and preparation. German commanders faced a choice: press forward into strengthening defenses and risk overextension, or consolidate gains and preserve combat power. The logic of the campaign favored caution. The original objective, disrupting Allied lines and exposing their weaknesses, had been achieved. A deeper thrust risked losing the very advantages that had made the offensive successful. Thus, on February 22nd, German pressure began to ease. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. Attacks became more limited. Probing replaced pushing. Defensive postures appeared, where offensive ones had dominated days earlier. For Allied forces, this shift was critical. It marked the end of the free fall. The battle was no longer spiraling outward. Losses still occurred, but they did not accelerate. The pass remained dangerous, but it was no longer a death funnel consuming entire units. This day also crystallized the lessons of Kasserine in real time. American commanders saw firsthand that artillery properly employed could halt armor. That terrain mattered more than bravado. That coordination, not courage alone, decided outcomes. These realizations would shape everything that followed, not just in Tunisia, but across the remainder of the war. By nightfall on February 22nd, it was clear that the German offensive had reached its high water mark. The Allies were bruised, humiliated, and bloodied, but still standing. The catastrophic totals that would define Kasserine had already been written, but the worst-case outcome had been avoided. The battle was not over. Fighting would continue into the next days as German forces disengaged and Allied units reorganized. But the decisive moment, the point at which collapse turned into survival, had passed. February 22nd did not bring victory. It brought something just as important: the end of uncontrolled defeat. By February 23, 1943, the violence inside Battle of Kasserine Pass no longer resembled a breakthrough. It looked like an operation winding down. The change was not announced. There was no clear order that said the offensive had failed. It revealed itself through absence: fewer attacks, shorter probes, longer pauses between movements. German forces began to disengage in stages. Armor that had pushed aggressively days earlier now repositioned defensively. Infantry consolidated ground already taken rather than pressing west. Artillery fire shifted from disruption to cover, shielding withdrawals and denying Allied counterattacks. This was not retreat under pressure. It was a calculated disengagement. For Allied troops inside and west of the pass, the shift was immediately noticeable. The shelling eased. German patrols appeared less frequently. Roads that had been death traps days earlier grew quiet enough to move wounded and reorganize units. The fear of sudden encirclement began to fade, but the battlefield told its own story. Kasserine Pass was littered with the debris of defeat. Burned-out tanks blocked narrow roads. Artillery pieces lay where crews had destroyed them, rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Trucks and half-tracks sat abandoned in ditches, their cargo spilled across the rocky ground. The pass looked less like a defensive position and more like a scrapyard created by panic. February 23rd was a day of reckoning for Allied commanders. Units were counted. Strength reports were compiled. Equipment lists were compared against what had existed only a week earlier. The results were sobering. By the time the fighting ended on February 24th, the losses had solidified into figures that would define the battle for generations. Allied casualties across the Kasserine-Sidi Bouzid operations were commonly summarized at around 10,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Within that number were approximately 3,000 prisoners, a statistic that struck particularly hard because it reflected collapse rather than combat losses alone. The equipment losses were equally stark. Allied forces lost approximately 183 tanks, 208 artillery pieces, and more than 600 vehicles. These were not losses incurred evenly across combat. Many were abandoned during withdrawals, destroyed by their crews, or captured intact. Each piece represented not only material cost, but lost combat power at a critical moment in the campaign. Axis losses, by comparison, remained relatively light. German and Italian forces suffered roughly 989 casualties killed, wounded, or missing. Equipment losses included about 20 tanks, 14 guns, and 67 vehicles, with approximately 608 Axis troops captured. The disparity was undeniable and humiliating for the Allies, yet numbers alone do not explain why the battle ended when it did. German commanders chose not to press further for strategic reasons. Their supply lines were stretched. Fuel and ammunition consumption had risen sharply. Allied resistance had stiffened. Most importantly, the original objective, disrupting Allied positions and exposing their weaknesses, had been achieved. A deeper push toward Tebessa risked overextension. German armor would have had to operate beyond the cover of the mountains, against improving Allied coordination and growing air pressure. The potential gains no longer justified the risk. For the Allies, the end of the fighting felt less like victory and more like survival. The line held, but barely. Central Tunisia remained in Allied hands, but confidence had been shattered. Kasserine Pass did not end with a triumphant counterattack. It ended with silence, and with officers staring at casualty lists they could not ignore. This silence was deceptive. The battle's real impact was only beginning to unfold. Within days, senior Allied leadership concluded that what had happened at Kasserine could not be blamed on bad luck or enemy brilliance alone. Structural failures had been exposed too clearly. Command arrangements, unit deployment, training assumptions, and doctrine all came under scrutiny. Kasserine became a case study almost immediately. Reports circulated detailing how dispersion of forces had invited defeat, how armor had been misused, how artillery had been underemployed, how command distance from the front had delayed decisions until it was too late. The men who had fought through the pass understood this instinctively. They had seen what happened when systems failed. They had watched how quickly collapse spread once coordination broke. And they knew that if the same methods were used again, the next battle could be worse. By February 24th, German units had pulled back to more defensible positions. Allied forces cautiously reoccupied sections of the pass. The fighting was over, but the meaning of Kasserine was still forming. It would soon be crystallized in a single, unmistakable decision, one that would reshape the U.S. Army's approach to the war. The guns around Battle of Kasserine Pass fell silent by February 24, 1943, but within Allied headquarters, the battle was only beginning. Kasserine had done something no training exercise, no war game, and no after-action memo ever could. It had made failure undeniable and visible all the way to the top. For Allied leadership, the numbers alone demanded accountability. Around 10,000 Allied casualties, 183 tanks gone, 208 artillery pieces lost, over 600 vehicles destroyed or abandoned, approximately 3,000 men captured. These were not the statistics of a hard-fought draw. They were the statistics of a systemic breakdown. At the center of that breakdown stood the commander of U.S. Tour. TUS-2 Corps, Lloyd Friedendahl. Friedendahl was not removed because he lost a battle. Generals lose battles and survive. He was removed because Kasserine exposed how he fought them. His headquarters had been located far behind the front, buried deep in a bunker complex that physically and psychologically separated command from combat. Orders traveled slowly. Situational awareness was fragmented. Initiative at lower levels was discouraged rather than empowered. At Kasserine, this distance proved fatal. Decisions arrived hours late. Units on the ground were left to interpret vague directives under fire. When conditions changed, as they constantly did during the German advance, there was no mechanism for rapid adjustment. By the time headquarters reacted, the damage was already done. Allied senior commanders understood that this could not continue. The North African campaign was not a sideshow. It was the proving ground for an army that would soon be asked to land in Sicily, Italy, and eventually France. If the U.S. Army could not fight German armor in Tunisia, it would not survive in Europe. The response was swift and unambiguous. On March 6, 1943, command of U.S. WWII Corps was transferred to George S. Patton. Patton's arrival was not symbolic. It was surgical. Within days, the atmosphere of the Sioux Corps changed. Discipline tightened immediately. Uniform standards were enforced. Weapons inspections became routine. Units were pushed closer to the front, not farther from it. Commanders were expected to know their terrain, their neighboring units, and their mission without excuses. But the most important change was doctrinal. Patton understood what Kasserine had revealed, that modern warfare was not about holding ground stubbornly or retreating cautiously. It was about speed, concentration, and initiative. Armor was to be massed, not scattered. Artillery was to be used aggressively and centrally, not parceled out. Commanders were expected to act, not wait. The lessons of Kasserine were translated directly into new practices. Artillery coordination was simplified so that fire could be called rapidly and concentrated instantly. Tank units trained to operate alongside infantry instead of ahead of them. Defensive positions were chosen for mutual support rather than convenience. Most critically, command moved forward. Patton made it clear that leaders belonged close enough to the fighting to understand it. Orders were shorter. Intent was emphasized over rigid instruction. Subordinate commanders were given latitude but held accountable for results. This was not about Patton's personality. It was about institutional shock. Kasserine had forced the U.S. Army to confront a truth it could no longer avoid. Training assumptions built in peacetime did not survive contact with experienced enemies. Only adaptation would. The impact was almost immediate. In the weeks following Patton's takeover, U.S. WWII Corps fought again in Tunisia, this time with markedly different results. Losses were still incurred. Mistakes still happened, but collapse did not. Units held under pressure. Artillery dominated approaches. German probes were met with coordinated responses rather than confusion. Kasserine thus became a dividing line in the American war. Everything before it belonged to an army learning in theory. Everything after it belonged to an army learning in blood and applying those lessons. This transformation mattered far beyond Tunisia. Officers who survived Kasserine carried its lessons forward. They remembered what happened when units were dispersed. They remembered what happened when tanks advanced alone. They remembered how fast panic spread when roads clogged and orders lagged. These memories shaped later battles in Sicily and Italy. They informed planning for Normandy. They influenced how American forces approached combined arms warfare for the rest of the war. In this sense, Kasserine was not merely a defeat. It was a forcing function. It stripped away illusion and replaced it with urgency. It made reform unavoidable. The cost was appalling. But the alternative, failing to learn, would have been worse. By early March 1943, the U.S. Army that emerged from Kasserine was no longer the same force that had entered the pass weeks earlier. It was harder, more disciplined, and more realistic about what it faced. And that change, born in a 2-mile-wide gap in the Atlas Mountains, would echo all the way to Normandy. The meaning of Battle of Kasserine Pass is not found in a single dramatic moment. It is found in accumulation, in how small failures multiplied, how terrain amplified mistakes, and how numbers recorded the cost with unforgiving clarity. This battle matters because it was the first time the United States Army confronted the reality of modern, mechanized warfare against a veteran enemy and failed publicly. Strip the story down to its facts, and the lesson is unavoidable. A 2-mile-wide pass became the focal point of an entire campaign. 5 days from February 19th to February 24th, 1943, were enough to expose systemic weaknesses. The price was around 10,000 Allied casualties. The receipt included 183 tanks, 208 artillery pieces, and over 600 vehicles lost. It included approximately 3,000 prisoners, captured not in heroic last stands, but in traffic jams, blocked roads, and collapsed command structures. These figures are repeated because repetition is the point. Kasserine is not remembered for clever maneuvers or decisive victories. It is remembered because the numbers force change. What happened at Kasserine was not inevitable. The Americans were not outnumbered. They were not outgunned. They were not abandoned by allies. They lost, because their system failed under pressure. Units were dispersed instead of concentrated. Armor was fed into battle piecemeal. Artillery was underused until it was almost too late. Command sat too far from the front to react at the speed the battlefield demanded. German forces, by contrast, demonstrated what experience looked like. With roughly 22,000 infantry and about 212 tanks, they achieved disproportionate results. Axis losses, often summarized at 989 casualties, around 20 tanks, and 14 guns, were light not because the Germans were invincible, but because they fought efficiently, preserved cohesion, and disengaged before advantage turned into overreach. That efficiency matters because it highlights the real danger Kasserine represented. This was not a heroic defeat against overwhelming odds. It was a warning shot. If the U.S. Army continued to fight this way, future campaigns would be worse. The most important outcome of Kasserine was not territorial. It was institutional. Within days, command changed. On March 6, 1943, George S. Patton took over USD Corps. That date matters because it marks the moment the U.S. Army accepted that adaptation was not optional. Discipline tightened. Command moved forward. Artillery was massed. Armor was integrated. Initiative was demanded, not discouraged. Kasserine forced the American Army to confront the difference between training and war. Before Kasserine, doctrine was theoretical. After Kasserine, doctrine was written in wreckage. Officers who survived the pass remembered what happened when roads clogged. They remembered how fast panic spread when orders lagged. They remembered how artillery, properly coordinated, could stop armor, and how its absence invited disaster. These lessons traveled. They appeared in Sicily, where American forces fought with greater cohesion. They shaped battles in Italy, where terrain again punished dispersion. They influenced Normandy, where concentration, coordination, and logistics were treated as matters of survival, not preference. Kasserine Pass thus occupies a unique place in World War II history. It is one of the few battles remembered not for victory or defeat alone, but for transformation. It is the moment when an army realized that confidence without experience was a liability. For the soldiers who fought there, the memory was more personal. They remembered burned vehicles blocking narrow roads. They remembered abandoning guns they could not move. They remembered the silence after surrender. These experiences were not erased by later victories. They became part of the institutional memory that shaped how American forces fought thereafter. That is why Kasserine still matters. Not because it was the worst defeat, not because it was the most violent battle, but because it was the moment illusion ended. A 2-mile gap in the Atlas Mountains forced a global power to relearn how to fight. The cost was written in men, machines, and prisoners. The lesson was written into doctrine. Kasserine Pass did not decide the North African campaign, but it decided something more important: whether the United States Army would adapt in time. It did. And that decision, forced by failure, echoed all the way to the beaches of Normandy.